What's going on, everybody? I'm Tony Gladney, and welcome back to Delta Flows, Restore the Delta's podcast that examines the future of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta as a region. The Delta is part of the largest estuary on the west coast of the Americas, and its ecosystem is of national importance. During our last episode, we were joined by Scott Artis from Golden State Salmon Association, who talks with me about the state of California's salmon fisheries and the commercial salmon industry, and the impacts connected through the webs of economics, ecology, and water management. Today, we are discussing about women in water. Many industries, including the water environment and environment sectors, are filled with misogynistic ideologies, systems, and individuals that perpetuate that cycle dating back decades. With colonization, land near and around waterways were claimed through the first in time, first in right water rights system, stripping away the lands from tribes and indigenous communities. Even today, water agency directors are 78% male, according to data compiled by Megan Fidel and Paul Shipman in 2023, in a study about race and gender demographics from local and state levels to detail who truly makes decisions about California's water. Today, we are welcoming Keiko Mertz and Ashley Overhouse onto Delta Flows. Keiko is a policy director for Friends of the River, whereas Ashley is a water policy advisor for Defenders of Wildlife's California program. Well, Keiko and Ashley, welcome to Delta Flows. So happy to have you all here with us today to just really learn from you and just hear about your experiences and really just dive in. So I know there's a lot to talk about today, but before we even get there, just want to just see how we're doing today. How are we feeling?
Feeling okay. Yeah, just I think really, really welcomed. Thank you and gratitude for being here. And, just a little tired, a little anxious. Yeah. I think many of us are. But, it's opportunities like this that help get us through.
Yeah, hanging in there. Echoing most of what Ashley said and just kind of processing some recent news that I think I'm just going to let be unsaid, but inherently most of it in this room know what I'm talking about and how that's going to impact our work especially.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, like you said, I'm sure there's going to be so much more conversation that we'll get into, just more details and nitty gritty. But really, can you guys just back it up and just really talk to our listeners and tell us about, I understand you guys both have an extensive history and really unique history around getting into just the field of water, your pathways here. If you guys could just share a little bit more with us about how you became interested in that and really ended up ultimately going down these career paths.
Sure, I'll start. So I think the first time I really ever thought about water in a professional sense or even academic was not until law school. I had no natural connection to waterways or water or even my natural environment really growing up in San Jose, California. I didn't even really think about the environment in a professional way until I went to college at UC Santa Cruz. I loved the ocean, but I never even lived by a healthy waterway growing up. And so it wasn't until I took an environmental law course where a professor told me that that was something I could not only study, but I could do professionally. And that I didn't have to necessarily practice law. I could advocate for changing the law, for healthy waterways, for healthy environments. And that was the first time I realized that there was something in the legal field that I was passionate about that would keep me going and waking up every morning and putting in that grueling work that it takes. It's worth it.
I love that. That's so nice to hear. I would say the driving force for me has always been a passion for and honestly fascination with wildlife. I like something I've been thinking lately is how, like, of all the billions of years this planet has existed, we get to coexist at the same time as otters. And like we get to watch otters being cute and videos of otters. And that's just like one example of little things I really love about wildlife and that excites me. So I grew up watching like Steve Irwin and obsessing over those kind of shows. And ultimately that turned into academic interest. And so I went to college and studied wildlife, which if you study wildlife from an academic sense, that really means the wildlife that gets managed. So that's ducks and fish especially. There's lots of funding in those categories. And then as my academic career advanced, I had planned when I was getting my master's degree to study breeding waterfowl in California. And then early in grad school, I read this paper, and these weren't even like the main results of the paper, but in this table, and I'll caveat this saying this was a study done in Europe, but there's this table in the paper that showed 2.5% of conservation decisions are based on science. And so I had entered this career path as a wildlife biologist thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to work towards saving the planet and also have fun doing it. And I kind of had this like revelation of like, wow, if I really want to make change, at least for me, what that's going to look like is moving into policy and trying to solve the systemic problems that are making it hard for our wildlife to prosper. And then water was just a natural place for that because fish passage keeps me up at night. And water impacts a life history stage of so many species in the state, especially our threatened and endangered species. Yeah.
Wow. No, thank you guys for that. Really just kind of giving us that background. And obviously both of you work in the policy space, advocacy space. And you mentioned something, Ashley, and I just wanted to just go into that a little bit more if you could just help us understand. You mentioned the difference between practicing law versus advocating to change the law. What does that look like? What does that mean in terms in this water space? What does that mean?
That's a great question. Thank you. I think first and foremost, practicing the law really means a day-to-day life of litigation and or representing clients. So you are dictated in some ways by their interests and whatever their legal claims are. You are a paid advocate. So you're still advocating in some ways, but you don't necessarily have as much control over how you advocate, what you advocate for. And in the end, the judge, if you go to trial, ends up making a ruling that may or may not go in your favor. And that still changes law in a lot of ways. But it's not necessarily as gratifying for me as looking at a legal regime and engaging in regulatory processes. So like, for example, speaking in front of the State Water Resources Control Board, or writing comment letters where you have 100 organizations or even leadership signed on, and seeing immediate decisions by leaders, whether it's local, state, or federal, that could be made a month later or 2 months later. And you are literally either creating law or changing how law is interpreted in real time. And sometimes when everything works out, you can see those tangible benefits on the ground to wildlife, to people, to waterways. And that, for me, is just much more gratifying than the practice of law.
That's awesome. No, that's really good. And really building on that point, and please, Keiko, jump in here if you have any additional thoughts, but really building on that point around the policy. And this is kind of a broad question, so I apologize for that, but please, we can narrow it down. But what are some of those primary focus areas in the policy work that you are focusing on or advocating on that are particularly important right now in our current work?
Yeah, so I'll start broad with you. At my organization, Friends of the River, we have a lot of key we call them work streams, focus areas, and those are advocating for sustainable water storage, restoring flows. We work on flood management, hydropower reform, and like Ashley was saying, regulatory and legislative advocacy as well. But right now, a really critical area of our focus is stopping what we call the triple threat, which is 3 processes that would really harm California's rivers. And those are Sites Reservoir, the Delta Tunnel, and the voluntary agreements.
In addition to that, at Defenders of Wildlife, we are also looking at some of the federal threats as well. So in addition to the triple threat that I support a lot of the work that Keiko and Friends of the River does in partnership with them, we also are looking at, frankly, federal legislation that could upend California water management. There are currently pending bills, as well as we are expecting new bills to come that would reprioritize water allocations through the whole system and undermine the Endangered Species Act as we know it for the state, as well as fund the raise of Shasta Dam and eliminate federal funding for a critical law that helps provide water supply to inland refuges and wetlands for birds and other freshwater wildlife. So, I think that those are really big priorities and issue areas for us.
Absolutely. Now, obviously, these priority areas that you guys are working on, these policy areas, do tackle problems. And I just wanted to clarify and follow up that are these issues that you guys talk about, the issues you guys are currently working on, does that really speak for all the issues in water management as a whole? Or like, I know it's a huge question, but just curious to build a little bit more into that.
That's a good clarifying question. No, my title, water policy advisor, is, in my opinion, a little deceiving because it feels like then I need to be aware of every single issue that could touch on water policy in California. And frankly, there are issues that our organizations don't necessarily address, which are water quality issues. So the proliferation of harmful algal blooms, Restore the Delta, is a really great advocate on. We also don't necessarily touch on the human right to water. There are still over 1 million California residents that don't have access to clean drinking water. There's also the issue of lead pipes and aging water infrastructure. We touch on that a little bit sometimes in our flood management work or when you're looking at hydropower reform. But generally speaking, water infrastructure throughout the state is very old and aging, whether you're talking about levees or dams or canals. And so that work takes a lot of additional on-the-ground advocacy and efforts. Mm-hmm. It's really a village of people that have to look at water policy from all angles.
Wow. Now, transitioning into some of the more like sensitive topics of this work, right? Because right now we even though we're talking about a lot, there's a lot of detail here. In a lot of ways, some could consider this like surface level. We're just scratching the surface of so much that's underneath, right? Yeah. And one of the things too, specifically what I mentioned earlier starting this show, in this episode is talking about women and water, right? And the misogyny that really just lies in the work. So really just want to transition us to that place in this conversation, because I do think it's a conversation, and we know that it's a conversation that needed to be had, and that we have some of our listeners that probably has very similar experiences of working in STEM, working even similar waterways, or just whatever that may look like. But with that being said, could you guys just share a little bit more about how misogyny has impacted yourself and just your work?
Sure. So I would say that I've been kind of lucky in my experiences here, mostly in that I've had quite a bit of positive experiences in my like immediate colleague network or coworker networks. And I think part of that is choosing an industry where we're all mostly cut from the same cloth. And I'm even talking back when I was working in wildlife. I was especially lucky there, I think, because that does tend to be like hunting, fishing culture and male dominated. But the small work groups I was in were female led and just very different. And so I think an example of, I'm going to start with an example of kind of a positive workspace, but hopefully as an example of what a workspace should look like, and then move on to some of my other like more female experiences. So I worked for this organization and I had a male boss, and it was my first science job, and I was doing field work, which means like out collecting data, catching fish, measuring them, clipping fins off of them, just out in the field in the rain. And fieldwork is one of the most vulnerable places for women in especially the science industry, like outdoor sciences, because they're really subject, there's not a lot of eyes out there. So they're very subject to harassment or even abuse. And my boss at that workplace, when I first got hired there, took me into an office and sat me down and was like, hey, here we take these things very seriously, and we believe women. And if anything ever happens to you, you can come to me or anyone on leadership, and we will take care of it, and we will take care of you. And I think, like, I'm feeling a little emotional repeating that, but like, I think I was fresh out of college when I had that experience, and I was like, wow, that was really nice. And like, didn't really understand the full impact of what that meant. But I wish that was an experience that more women had. And so then moving into my like more typical female experiences. So the first one I want to talk about is women are often valued for the way they look. And for what that looks like for me is in the context of my work, I'm often referred to as like, well, let's have Keiko do it. She could be the face of this thing. She's pretty, etc. And like, I'm not even going to pretend that offends me. In fact, it's a privilege to be thought of in that way. And it is a nod to the fact that as a woman, part of my value is derived from the way I look. And inherently that means that can be eroded. And so I think I raise that just as something that's a thing that we have to think about as women, is how we look and how we're perceived in that way. And then I'll just share one other example, and then I'll hand it off to Ashley. But I think kind of more of a rough experience I had recently, and I guess I say this as like, I think women experience this more as they kind of start coming into their power, is I was asked to fill a very small speaking role at an event as part of a larger program. And the short of it is the audience received it well and were excited. And then later during that event, a man came up to me to basically tell me that I had no skills in inspirational speaking. I know. And so at first I was like hurt by this and a little confused. And to me, it's actually mostly pretty funny now because it's rather absurd. But I also think that this experience really speaks to the habit of people to cut women down when they're at a point of success. And then just as women having to learn how to process that.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
Thank you for really opening up this conversation with these really pivotal examples.
Thanks, Keiko, for sharing that. Really grateful. I think I have not been so lucky in some ways, if you're comparing it in terms of life experiences. I've experienced everything from explicit sexism to sexual harassment in the workplace multiple times, to microaggressions and everything in between. I had to learn how to file, sexual harassment complaints at law firms for myself. I had to file one in law school. And I think by the time I got into the policy field, I was, I think, a little defensive about entering male-dominated workspaces, I think because of those experiences. Now, that being said, I don't think anything of that could have prepared me for some of the sexism I faced early on in my policy career. So I'll just touch on one example that I had at an irrigation district in what we call the gold rush towns of California in the Sierra foothills. It was a all-white, male-dominated irrigation district board. And I went up to give my first public comment on a proposed dam project that they were moving forward, spending on average, I think, $4 to $8 million a year with no environmental approvals and no modeling that would show that this storage project would actually help the community or help anyone downstream, for that matter. We have over 1,300 reservoirs in the state, so they wanted to add just one more, to that list. And I gave my public comment, and as I was walking away, one of the board district members referred to me as Little Lady. The overall tone of the comment was pretty dismissive. And it was just a really clear reminder of how I was perceived in public settings. Yes, I was starting to come into my power as a professional, as an advocate, and how I reacted in the moment was embarrassment and shame. Internalizing that as somehow that was my fault was something I had to learn from and grow from over the years. And I'm really grateful for other women in my workplace at that time immediately, but also women in my family who helped me understand that what I am in control of was my reaction and how I move forward, and calling out that kind of behavior in real time appropriately. So that's something I've had to learn how to do over the years.
Wow. Thank you also for sharing that. And I'm so just grateful for this opportunity to have this conversation and excited to get into that conversation around like how have you guys addressed that, right? And how have you guys been able to navigate and work through that? Right now, I want to take a break so we can get into some PSAs, but also just so us and our listeners can have a moment to just sit with that sit with these comments. I believe that you all deserve that, and women in this work deserve these times for us to just kind of sit with the realities, right? That you all have to work with every single day. So with that, we're going to take a quick break in this conversation with our guest here, and for some public service announcements with Restore the Delta's MacKenzie Owens.
Hi everyone, I'm MacKenzie with Restore the Delta. I'll be providing public service announcements for today's episode. During the previous episode, we shared upcoming outreach events in November and general tunnel updates. This week, I'd like to share general organization updates and community events in December. Please join us for an upcoming environmental justice workshop to learn about and provide feedback on adaptation strategies of drought, salinity, and sea level rise for the Delta. This is led by the Just Transitions in the Delta Research Project team from University of California and is conducting community engagement to further progress equitable water management and climate adaptation measures for the Delta. This is from 3 to 7 p.m., December 3rd at 1234 West Oak Street in Stockton, California. Those who have a vested interest in the Delta, particularly those from frontline and environmental justice (EJ) communities, as well as environmental justice advocates, are highly encouraged to attend. This is a great opportunity to provide input on regional planning for the future of the Delta. The overall goal of this workshop is to review information provided so far about the adaptation scenarios and gain further feedback from Delta communities to ensure it is accounted for and discussed when conducting future research. Restore the Delta is helping co-convene this event and is participating in the Just Transitions project so that the Delta has a voice in long-term planning in relation to climate change. Our goal is that planning for climate change will benefit the region's environment and green economic development, and that we do not become California's sacrifice zone. For those interested in learning more about the Mormon Slough Restoration Project, Restore the Delta, as a part of the Mormon Slough Restoration Association, is hosting a community meeting at the Stribley Community Center in Stockton. Join us on December 7th from 3 to 4 p.m. to learn more about the project and its objectives. The goal of the Mormon Slough Restoration Association and partner organizations for this event is to provide the community with a space for constructive feedback and dialogue for design elements for the restoration project. For example, if you want to see increased green spaces, bike paths, or parks, we encourage you to attend for your valuable input. After a 15-minute presentation, we are open to addressing community concerns, suggestions, ideas, and, of course, cultivating a space for your voice. Also going on that weekend is the 32nd Annual Festival of Trees, a tradition at the San Joaquin County Museum, which is a 2-day event celebrating the holidays with various entertainment, arts and crafts, food, and decorative Christmas trees across the property. The main event is on December 7th and December 8th from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. This is a wonderful opportunity to experience with your loved ones and community. Now, I'll be passing over to Miniya Joy and Tilley from With Our Words. Thank you.
Welcome back to the Delta Flows podcast. My name is Miniya Joy.
My name is Giovonni Tilley.
And today we're going to start talking about how youth engage in water activism. So we actually have a little bit of experience in this, don't we? Mm-hmm. Like, you remember going to some water board meetings, right?
Yes.
Talk about your experience.
A lot of them, well, first, I love topics like this, especially the environment.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of times we really overlook the environment as a whole. So being able to go in and sit in on a lot of these meetings and see how our environment is currently being impacted is insightful.
Yeah.
I feel, what is your experience?
Honestly, going in, you're absolutely right. It's really insightful to see how it's working around us, because a lot of times when we talk about the environment, when you're a kid, you think the environment, it's everything. When you get it boiled down to, okay, we're going to talk about water and how it's going to affect these, like, we're going to talk about how it affects these animals or how it's going to affect you. It's makes it a bit easier, but also makes it a lot more difficult. Something else I noticed is a huge gender divide. Like, I remember actually going to water board meetings, and I would see like 3 to 5 women, and the rest is just men. and the rest was just men. It was kind of intimidating because it's like, okay, I know what I'm talking about, but also there's a lot of men here and I really don't want to deal with someone saying, you don't know what you're talking about. You know what I mean?
I do. Personally, I'm not a woman, clearly, but
It's okay.
I can speak on behalf of people that I know that have been in fields like this, and they say it's extremely difficult first. There's a lot of expectations already put on you because you are, especially when I was going to UC Merced, which has a lot of engineering and STEM fields, you are like 1 or 2 women out of a class of 40 or 50 men.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I know a lot of them, me personally, the ones that I knew, some of them were a little dissuaded, but there were a lot of them that kind of looked at that as like a challenge.
Yeah. No, to a certain extent, I think it does become a bit of a challenge. Like, okay, I know that there aren't a lot of us out here, so let me make sure that the door's open for us to go into these places. But at the same time, I also can see how that's incredibly challenging because something that I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent here, but not too much of one. A lot of times I think when it comes to women in STEM and discussing the environment, specifically water work, there's this huge belief that, okay, women argue feelings and men argue facts. But at the same time, what I think we forget is when we talk about the environment, we forget that it affects people. These numbers are going to impact you. What's going to happen to your water is going to impact the things around you. So I don't think that should be looked at as weakness. I think that needs to be looked at as strength. So on the topic of women working in water, I just want to take a quick moment to shout out some of the amazing women that are working with Delta Flows. I've got a whole list right here, but I'm going to try to go through as quick as I can. Cynthia Cortez, Barbara Berrigan, Perea, Mariah Looney, Christina Polke, Artie Valencia, Sarah Medina, Esther Mburu, MacKenzie Owens, and Morgan Snyder, who has an amazing service dog, by the way. And I want to shout out, she's got a service dog. He's real cute.
Aww.
And on top of that, I also want to take a moment so we can shout out our special guests.
Yes, Keiko Mertz and Ashley Overhouse.
You know, it absolutely is incredibly intimidating to see a STEM field, and when it's dominated by men, looking for women is kind of like finding a needle in a haystack or finding a lighthouse in the middle of a raging Atlantic Sea. But these are some of the lighthouses, and we see you and we salute you.
Thank you.
So once again, my name is Miniya Joy.
And my name is Giovonni Tilley.
And we're going to go back to you, Tony.
Well, welcome back, everyone, and thank you so much to Miniya Joy and Gio Tilley for that super important segment with our words. Also, thank you so much to MacKenzie Owens for the PSAs, and welcome back to Keiko and Ashley. Before the break, we were talking about you all, how you all have been experiencing misogyny in the work, and obviously your experience here in the work. And before we get into just really how you all have been addressing that and navigating the space here, I really wanted to just kind of back it up because both of you, prior to the break, had talked about just really doing this work factually, right? Data-driven, and really the lack of that sometimes, right? And really, I wanted to get into, is any of that correlated with misogyny in some cases? Or have you guys had to experience that in some cases where you guys are seeing like, this is not really data-driven, but you maybe had to be the voice of reason?
So I'm going to talk about a mentor that I had that really influenced the trajectory of my career. This person's name is Rachel Johnson. She is a fish biologist at the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration. And I learned a concept from her and in grad school broadly called translational ecology. So this is actually like where I was like aiming my arrow for career endpoint and then like diverged off the course even further from wildlife biologist. But the concept of translational ecology and a translational ecologist is someone who works between science and policy. And so for me personally, what that looks like is I bring my science background as a toolkit to this work. So when science is brought up in the room, I can honestly process it faster than our policy information, which I'm still learning from a fire hose. But to your point, now that I think about it, people don't expect me to know that science. And I've never really thought of it from a female perspective. I've just thought of it from that's policy girl, not science girl. But I'm often like, oh yeah, I know that I worked in fish biology. And people are like, whoa, you worked in fish biology? Like, yeah, I kind of love fish. Yeah, I guess that's my experience on that front.
I think coming from a legal background, I've had the advantage of maybe leaning into that preconceived notion of that I wouldn't necessarily know the scientific background to give me more time to get up to speed. And in some ways, my partnership with Keiko in a lot of forums has been incredibly effective because we can share information in real time with both the scientific knowledge and legal knowledge and make it very effective in any conversation, especially when we're there together. It's been incredibly powerful and very gratifying, by the way. And it also has taught me that, yes, over 90% of the rooms that we are in where there are decision makers, they are making decisions based on the political circumstances, not based on the best available science. And I joke with my family and friends that how I describe my job and what I do more often than not is I just request all of my leaders, whether they're local, state, or federal, to make decisions based on science. Yeah. And I say it in various different ways, with maybe some fluff around that on the edges and depending on the context. But really, it is just nicely asking, please make decisions based on the best available science that you have, rather than the political circumstances that are driving you to go this route. It is really interesting doing that as a woman because, yes, we are often then seen as the voice of reason, or even further, we are sometimes seen as the nicer voice in the room, or sometimes expected to be kinder. Mm-hmm. And I think because of that, sometimes the voice of reason becomes seen as harsh or aggressive. And I've also recently tried to lean into that because I felt empowered to do that. And it's also meant that I can sometimes convey really hard concepts and watch the reactions with gratification. Yeah. And sometimes there are positive results from that too. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. Thank you so much for really sharing both of your perspectives on that. What I'm hearing really, one of the ways you all address that, really leaning on you all, you guys, your relationships you have with one another. And then also you said leaning into those preconceived notions, right? If I'm going to give it to you. So I'm just curious if you guys could just kind of expand a little bit more on how else do you just continue to navigate and address these misogynistic ideologies and just tendencies in the workspace or in the water industry?
Well, I have a little joke to kind of enter my question, which is, where do mansplainers get their water? A well, actually. Water is a very punny space. In this case, it is a phrase that I literally hear once a week. Well, actually. On something that I've usually said in one way or another previously in a conversation. And the way that I've had to learn how to deal with that and respond in real time has been a journey. I'm very grateful for the women in the room, the lighthouses that have helped me respond. I think making sure I'm not internalizing that because it feels like in the moment that my voice doesn't matter. They didn't hear what I said, or that I maybe was wrong. So I go as far as to doubt what I have vocalized, whether it's a minor contribution in a conversation to even a public statement in a forum where there's decision makers. Really, it's become an issue of I have to think about what I've said, why it matters, even if I feel like it's repetitive, and I push ahead. And then I also have to take a second to remember to actually address the behavior in real time. In as respectful of a way as possible, but more importantly, constructively, especially with some of our partners and our friends, to make sure that they are learning from that experience just as much as I am.
Wow. I feel like so many of us, it's just in any general situation, if we have to continue just to repeat ourselves, nothing else, that's frustrating, right? And to hear that you all have to do this on a daily basis, I'm just super curious, what is it that brings you back the next day, every day, to do it again? Like, what is that drives you all? to continue to be these advocates in these spaces?
For me, it touches back on like my passion and interest for wildlife, and just like the reason I chose this work is because it's fulfilling, it's meaningful. You get to drive change, you get to pick a direction and go, and it would not be possible in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is this is only possible because I have Ashley and people like her and our entire network of colleagues that I get to count on to learn from and to support me, and then I reciprocate that. And the friendship and congeniality is really truly what makes us, I don't mean to speak for you, what makes me able to get out of bed on days where there's like a particularly bad piece of news or a particularly egregious decision that was made. Being able to get up and keep pushing forward is, for me, solely having that community.
Yes. Community is really what gets me out of bed every morning. I think, especially in the last couple of weeks, I have leaned heavily on that community. And I think that is made up of both Keiko, Cynthia, and others in our world, but also the unexpected community support that I've received from some of our male partners as well, who have openly and verbally acknowledged how our experiences may be different, but also sharing in the oscillation of emotions that happens while we're doing this work, because it is personal in some ways. You're affecting people's lives. Water is a fundamental part of people's lives. And I think that because it's also been incredibly politicized, there is just no way to sometimes separate yourself depending on what kind of situations you're in. And frankly, I don't think you should. I think passion is what is the other component in addition to community that helps get us out of bed in the morning. And clearly, I mean, we're both here and we're passionate, but if that can burn out at times, right? Without that friendship, without that support. I'm really grateful.
Yeah, and to the point about burning out, it just made me think of an analogy of like the days that you burn out, one of our friends comes and relights the light.
Yeah.
It really is that way.
Yeah. Thank you guys for really just sharing that. And I think that obviously we want to get to a place where that's the norm, right? Where the community is the norm, where women and water are the norm, where we don't have to have the conversations of like, well, what do we do, right? Specifically, right? We want this to just be the norm, to have that pathway and to have that available. So what are some changes or things that you would just like to see implemented for that to be the norm, to have a more inclusive environment?
So there's the obvious ones, right? Like equal pay for women and like don't interrupt women and give women credit for their ideas. Like the really basic ones that I think like a lot of powerful women harp about. But there's one thing that I've kind of been thinking about, and maybe this doesn't quite answer your question, but something I really wish I saw more in female leaders in our space, and I'm talking more like the bureaucratic space than like Ashley and I's advocacy space, is I wish that I saw more women who felt comfortable leading from a place of their femininity and their feminine energy, because a lot of what I've witnessed, at least, is women who are able to make it. You know, there was that statistic like 78% are men in those roles. Women who are able to make it into those roles often have to take on a lot of the persona of their male peers. This is observationally speaking. And I think that has led even female like water managers to lead from a place of like an extractive mindset that has kind of gotten us to where we are with our water system in California. And I would really love to see a shift in the extractive mindset. And I really feel like women should be leading the charge of that.
Me too. Thanks, Keiko.
Yeah, like you or I.
Sounds great.
Yeah. I agree.
In addition to that wonderful list of things that I would, even if they're considered obvious, I would like to see equal pay for women, bare minimum, especially in this space. I think that in addition to that list that Keiko mentioned, another thing that I would really like to see is additional mentorship. It was incredibly valuable for me in my early days in this field. And as we are facing a really large age gap in advocates in this space, I am concerned that more pressure will be put on younger people in this space to retain institutional knowledge, to suddenly know exactly how to go about advocating and getting into grassroots advocacy, and suddenly just gaining the experience that they need years to gather sometimes. Mentorship is going to be that bridge. And I think it's absolutely essential that we try to incentivize mentorship because it goes both ways. And I don't want people to feel ever abused in a sense because it takes emotional energy and to do that. And I want it to be gratifying and a supportive experience. And that's something that I hope to give. And I hope that others will also follow that practice because I want to just frankly give back what was given to me. It really does take a community, right? We want to form that community. The only way that we're going to do that is to recruit people into that community.
That was literally a seamless segue to the next point that I was going to make, because I'll just say this first. I really wish that we could have some live footage of all the people that would consider you all mentors, of all the individuals who look to you all as leaders. I can only imagine, just hearing the passion, hearing everything you guys are really talking to me about today, I can only imagine. But also, what one of my mentors told me that in order to be a leader, you have to have know how to follow, right? So who in particular have been those mentors for you, whether it be women in waters or who have been those leaders for you? And more specifically, even for our listeners, we do have those young people that are looking to get into this work, or they're interested now because they heard you, who are these people they can look to in this space? Outside of you guys, of course.
Well, I would like to first give a shout out to Chris Schutz, who is the executive director of the California Sport Fishing Protection Alliance. He is one of the very first people who called me in my first job in this policy space and just wanted to know more about me. It was a phone call, welcomed me as a new hire. He's not even part of the organization I was hired by, and offered himself to be a mentor, to be a source of information and support. And he really, truly has been now over 9 years later. And I'm very grateful for that. And then, second to Chris, I think that Jan Dorman, Barbara Berrigan-Perea, Rachel Zwillinger, I've been very grateful for all of these really powerful women who have provided so much wisdom and guidance for me through many really critical and hard years in the policy space.
Well, Ashley and I share a lot of mentors. So to her list, I will add a couple staff who are at FOR that are our senior policy staff at Friends of the River. Ron Stork and Gary Bobker have worked each 30 to 40 years in our industry and are as giving as Chris and open to sharing information and strategizing with you, which I am grateful for. And then I want to share three of my sheroes. One of them is Ashley. Ashley for me has been like my nearest term career model. I joke around that she's my policy big sister because every time she leaves a job, I take that job. It's happened twice now. And so then it just makes it such a good fit where if I'm confused about something, I'm like, I know who would know the answer to this. And sometimes that's just like actually questions about processing like our work environment as a woman even. I've come to her with those kind of questions. And then I mentioned another one of my sheroes, Rachel Johnson. She is like one of those people that just leads with kindness and softness, but is so effective and respected. And it was wonderful to like have her as a model throughout my career. And the other, Ashley already mentioned, is my boss, Jan Dorman, who her background is like executive leadership. And so I just get executive coaching honestly whenever I want. And Ashley is allowed to do the same, and it's really, really valuable, and she gives it freely.
Wow. Thank you. Shout out to all those folks. Hopefully they're listening. And if not, somebody send it to them. All right. But as we come to a close here, in addition to the folks and everything you guys just shared, are there any just additional resources such as like books and teachings, organizations, or readings that folks can really just lean into that you would recommend, particularly when battling misogyny in the work, when battling these systemic issues?
When I was in law school at UC Law San Francisco, or previously known as UC Hastings, I started a chapter of Ms. JD. And yes, it's a cringy name, I think, but MS period JD. So for those that are considering law school or are in the legal space, that gave me resources, structure, and support immediately. And frankly, after a really hard first year of law school and having to file a sexual harassment claim and going through that process, having a organization on campus that I could immediately go to for resources, training, and support was essential. There are equivalent organizations to Ms. JD in every space, it feels like. I'm not as familiar with them, but I think that student government is also a way to vocalize your power and voice issues. So even if there are not on-campus organizations to give you support that you deserve, I would highly encourage involvement in any sort of student government or government body, or frankly, even local government. There is no issue too small. No issue too small. That is the whole point of those public comment periods at the beginning of every single community meeting. It doesn't mean that your issue needs to be on the agenda. It doesn't mean that you need to even see yourself in your representation or even adequately represented. And I think that that is the backbone of support if you need it. And then I'm going to shout it from the rooftops because when it was published, I just loved this book, and it was Intersectional Environmentalism by Leah Thomas. And I think that it changed my view of how I advocate as an environmentalist and as a woman. And I think that everyone should read it.
Those are really great recommendations. I have a couple book recommendations and a podcast recommendation. First, for anyone who's interested in like getting to know California water, and I would say in the way Ashley and I know, where we're at the point that we probably feel like conspiracy theorists, reading The Dreamt Land by Mark Arax is like fast-tracked to getting some of that knowledge. The story of why California water is the way it is right now. It's perfect. Another book I would recommend is called What Happened by Hillary Clinton. And this is from like more of like the analyzing the female experience. She wrote it about the 2016 election, but it was really about what it's like to be a powerful woman and how society receives that. So I just thought it was like, I don't even actually remember if that was the core point of the book, but that has always been my key takeaway of like, oh my gosh, wow. And then there's a podcast I really love lately called Wiser Than Me by Julia Louis-Dreyfus, where every week she interviews a woman who is older than her, and therefore she assumes wiser than her. And I didn't have a mom, and so there's like a lot of little wisdoms that like I just didn't get exposed to. I didn't have an older, wiser woman in my life. And so I just feel like that not only is such like relevant, like she interviewed Jane Goodall, Jane Fonda, Julie Andrews, like iconic women, and like getting their wisdom is just really fulfilling for the soul, but in a powerful way too.
Ashley and Keiko, thank you guys so much for being here and having the conversation, which was the easier part, but thank you for being a lighthouse for just so many out there. Thank you guys for trusting me and having this conversation and sitting down with us. It's so valuable. I know our listeners are going to grow so much. Thank you so much to With Our Words, Miniya, Joy, and Gio Tilley for also being lighthouses for our young people out there as well. My name is Tony, y'all. I'm the host here of Delta Flows Podcast. Thank you all so much for joining us to talk about women in water and also water management systems. I look forward to seeing you all next episode.